The SH-9 is the latest THX-based amp from SMSL, and it's under $300, but this time it comes with a remote control. And being THX-based, it measures excellently, but are excellent measurements enough for it to reproduce music to the same degree that it measures? Well, that's what I'll be talking about in this video. Just quickly before we get started, I wanted to recommend Backblaze for online backups. This is a company I have been using for many years to back up all my stuff, all my video recordings, absolutely everything, terabytes of it. Now they offer for a flat rate, you can back up as much as you like, completely unlimited, completely unthrottled on one computer. And that, for example, if I were to back up all my video online via conventional cloud backups, it would cost me hundreds or thousands of dollars per month. This is a flat rate for 1 month or 1 year. And they have a 30-day trial, so you can try them out and see how you go and see if it works for you. And if you did have a catastrophe, for example, where you lost absolutely everything, all your computers and everything, you'd have all your stuff backed up online. So just check out the link in the description or on screen for that, and that also helps support my videos a little bit as well. You may have already noticed that on the front of this amp it has a 4-pin XLR output, and this is usually associated with balanced headphone output, but actually the circuit inside the SH-9, like the little SP200 amp that I previously reviewed, is actually not balanced. It does have balanced inputs though on the back, these dual 3-pin XLR inputs, but they are converted to regular single-ended inputs, so you may as well just use the RCA inputs, though you do have that flexibility. And with just a power socket on the back, that's all it does is act as a headphone amp, so no preamplifier options there. It does have a screen on the front, which instead of having switches like the SP200, everything is managed either via this volume control, which will also press in, or via the remote control, which will also operate their DACs, depending on which of these buttons you press. The SH-9 follows on the form of the SU-9 DAC, which I'm going to review in a different video. Unlike the SP200 and M200 we see here, it ditches the kind of weirdly trapezoidal shape which did bug some people and exchanges hard switches for a menu system, and this is primarily controlled via the remote control. If you do end up buying both the DAC and amp, you can switch between them using B for the amp and C for the DAC, while pressing C will allow you to control the inputs and outputs of and other features of the SU-9. Switching to B here allows me to control the various options for the SH-9, and that includes the input, which can be balanced or unbalanced, or we can go in here and change the gain mode. The volume mode, now the volume is interesting because it uses a stepped relay attenuator, much like these larger audio GD amps, but in a more compact system. And so you can control how fast that ramps up, whether it skips some of the resistors or not. The other thing you can control, of course, is the screen brightness, which will help people who listen like listening in the dark. And the other thing, of course, it shows the firmware version of the amp. So that's, for some people, I prefer, switches on the front in some cases, but for people who may want to use a remote control for controlling the volume, this may be very handy. So in listening with the SH-9, it had one useful advantage over the SP200, and that is it doesn't have this regular volume attenuator. Now these attenuators sometimes have a little bit of channel imbalance down at the very beginning of the travel and often at the very end. Using a digitally controlled resistor array, that can be eliminated very easily, and that was one of the nice advantages. However, in terms of actually using this with in-ear monitors, which some people may consider, I tried it with Campfire Audio's new 2020 Andromedas, which are actually very sensitive in-ear monitors. Thankfully, the amp had literally zero hiss that I could detect. Maybe if there was any, it was so minute it was almost inaudible, and probably the background noise in my room, which is actually very quiet, was probably louder. So we'll just say none effectively in that regard. However, going from the lowest volume to the first volume setting on low gain, the volume jumped up quite a bit on just some regular music that even wasn't so compressed. So it doesn't really have enough volume range for very sensitive in-ear monitors, though regular, less sensitive in-ear monitors might be okay. Probably the more normal use will be with some full-sized headphones, and that, well, performance I found was kind of similar to the SP200. Initially it sounds very clean and clear whether you're using your HD6XX or some kind of planers. It sounds good initially, but can sound a little bit flat overall. For instance, there was kind of an odd situation. I was listening to Elton John's Madman on the Water, and halfway through that they kind of introduced some digital kind of I can't describe what it is. It kind of sounds a little bit kind of harsh and distorted. And initially I thought when listening, well, what was that? And I unplugged my headphones and plugged them actually into the Master 9 to double check what I was listening to. And they'd introduced a particular kind of, well, I suppose, synthesized notes in there. And it sounded out of the SH-9 like just distortion, whereas through the Master 9 I could detect, actually that was an intentional bit of synthesized music inserted, and I could hear the kind of distinct texture that they'd inserted on that. One of the other things on that particular track was the percussion, and that's where something like these very small amps can't compete with something, in this case double the price, is Audio GD's NFB1 amp. Now the difference between this and the difference between this, well, size, but why is this amp a lot larger? And the reason is power supply. These amps are mostly power supply. They're large transformers and multiple power supply groups with a large amount of capacitance to store energy for handling the dynamics and the music very well. And that's just something the small power supply that's in this cannot compete with. And that's one of the things where measurements can really trap you in these things. You can measure these amps and say, oh, this one has the lower distortion or whatever, but that's measuring using just a single sine wave or a sweep. And that's like kind of like driving a car along a straight road to test its kind of normal performance, or just saying, well, I drove it around the block and it went around the block okay, so it's good enough. Doesn't really reflect how an amp will perform when actually playing back music, which is not just a single sine wave, but is a complex series of thousands, millions, or billions of sine waves all interacting at the same time. And just like a car on a racetrack, if the amplifier can't keep up with that, then, well, the music's not going to sound quite so good. And it was very noticeable how much weaker the percussion was out of these smaller amps compared to, say, the double-priced NFB1 amp. The percussion really had some more impact out of the larger amps, whereas out of here it sounded kind of weak and the whole amp kind of output sounded somewhat flat. Now some people might consider this weaker bass sounding more clear because it does bring out the treble more, but it's something that it doesn't matter how clever the technology is in the THX design, if the power supply can't feed enough power for the amp to keep up with the music, well, it's just not going to perform so well when you're actually playing back music. So as a kind of basic amp, well, the thing was, just like the SP200, these amps were outperformed by the cheaper Schiit Audio Asgard, which, at $200, it was one of those amps that Schiit Audio decided they weren't going to increase the price, even though they did increase the parts complexity, and in that it makes it an absolute bargain. It doesn't have quite the clean, clear sound. It has a little bit more of a kind of warm, euphonic sound about it, but it's overall you can hear the better dynamics out of that kind of amp. Even the higher priced AAA 789 from Drop has a little bit better dynamics in that regard. It doesn't sound quite so flat as some of the AAA amps can sound, and I guess because it has a better power supply. And you can also buy an external power supply for it, something you can't do from these smaller amps. So in the end, if you really like it, it appeals to you to have an amp with excellent measurements, do be warned that it doesn't necessarily translate to excellent performance. There's just a limit to how much performance you can get out of something this small, and this is why larger amps such as these have much bigger power supplies. It is just simply, you can't beat more comprehensively designed technology. So I'd like to thank APOS Audio for sending me one of these for review. It's been interesting trying out all these little amps and seeing how they perform versus the larger amps that are available. If you did like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you're notified when I have a new review out. Also, thanks to everyone who has been supporting me. Consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get to get my buying advice anytime, and they also get to see my impressions of gear before I post them. Also get to see my reviews in advance and alternate takes and behind the scenes material. So do consider becoming a supporter. It could save you money down the track by not buying the wrong thing. So thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.